Hello, BookTube. The book I want to talk about today is Mr. American by George MacDonald Fraser, originally published in 1980. This is an interesting book because it's a tie-in with the Flashman series, and yet the book in tone and style is completely different than the rest of the Flashman series. So first of all, what is the Flashman series? I've actually talked about the Flashman series a lot before on this channel, and I will link in the description down below to past videos where I explain at length who is Flashman and what is the Flashman series. But just to recap very briefly, Flashman series is a series of historical fiction books about a character named Flashman, who is a soldier in the British Empire during the 19th century, primarily the 19th century, who goes on all sorts of adventures all around the British Empire and interacts with real historical figures and real historical events, although the character himself is fictional. But it's not just straight historical fiction, it's also comedy. Irreverent comedy, because the character of Flashman himself is a scoundrel. He's a completely immoral character who only cares about himself and has somehow managed to fool everyone around him into thinking that he's a great hero when he's really just a scoundrel. The books are a lot of fun to read, but they are arguably lowbrow. I mean, they're packed full of historical details, so you do learn a lot of history from them, but they're full of sexual misadventures, exotic women, arguably stereotypes of foreign nationalities, and generally guilty pleasures, although again, you do learn a lot of history from them. Now, as I was researching the Flashman series, I learned from Wikipedia and other sources that in addition to the 12 books in the canonical Flashman series, there are a couple other books that the author, George MacDonald Fraser, wrote that tie into the Flashman series. And one of them is Mr. American. So after I finished the 12 books in the Flashman series, I decided I wanted to track down and read Mr. American, which I suspect is the reason that most people track it down and read it, right? Right? People who've read it out there, you read it because of the Flashman connection, right? But then you start to read the book and you discover it is nothing like the other Flashman books. In a good way. This book is, I think, much better written than any of the other Flashman books. It seems to be operating at an entirely different level, and I was impressed to see that George MacDonald Fraser is a man of more talents than I gave him credit for. He can write in different genres and write in different genres well. So it's almost a completely different genre than the Flashman series. I mean, they're both historical fiction, but that's as far as it goes. The tone of this book is completely different. It's also much longer than your typical Flashman book. The edition I had was, I believe, close to 600 pages, 585, I think. Typical Flashman book is somewhere around 300 pages. So this one's a little bit thicker. The other thing to note is I had thought that Flashman just makes a brief appearance in this book. That's just kind of a cameo appearance. But he actually dominates the middle section of the book. So it's not just a cameo appearance. This is arguably the unofficial 13th book in the Flashman series. Now, this book takes place in 1910 to 1914, the lead up to World War I, and it's near the end of Flashman's life. Like I said earlier, the Flashman books take place during the Victorian era. In 1910 to 1914, Flashman starts off the book at 88, and when we last see him, he is 92. So, he's lived to a ripe old age, and this is presumably his last adventure. But the interesting thing to note here is that in terms of publication order, this book was published in 1980, and there were 6 more books in the Flashman series that came after this book. So in terms of internal chronology, this is at the very end of Flashman's life, but in terms of publication order, this is right smack in the middle of the Flashman canon. And I might get around to commenting on that later, but there are a few things in the later books that will revise Flashman's history from this period. But hold that thought for now. There's a couple other things I want to talk about. So I mentioned that this book is completely different than the rest of the Flashman books. And in terms of the narration style, it definitely is. This is a book that really takes its time to create a scene, to establish characters and just hang out with the characters. Well, the plot is really not moving very fast at all. And it reminded me in that respect of War and Peace. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that this book is a classic equal to War and Peace, although it is quite good, but it's not that good. It's not one of the classics of Western civilization like War and Peace is. But it did strike me that there were a number of parallels between this book and War and Peace, and the more parallels I began to notice, the more I began to suspect that this wasn't an accident, that these parallels were intentional, that George MacDonald Fraser was deliberately trying to evoke a book on the same sense of War and Peace. So what do I mean by that? Well, War and Peace is a book where you have to get into the mindset that you're just going to hang out with these characters and you're not really concerned about the plot, because the plot is moving at a snail's pace throughout most of the book. I mean, there is a plot, but it's just very, very slowly developing. And your purpose as a reader with War and Peace is just to hang out with the characters and enjoy listening to their conversations, enjoy the atmosphere. And if you're reading War and Peace, like, come on, let's get to the story, you're going to drive yourself nuts. Mr. American is exactly the same kind of book in that respect. There is a plot, but the point of the book is not the plot. The point of the book is to just hang out with the characters, listen to them talk, and enjoy the atmosphere. Now, not every author can pull this off. But George MacDonald Fraser can pull it off. And again, it was as a completely different side of his writing than I knew from his Flashman books. But he pulls it off brilliantly. So there are scenes, for example, there's a description of a party which goes on for a full 30 pages where you're just hanging out with the characters, listening to them talk, you're watching them play cards for 30 pages, and it works. I was turning the pages, I was not bored at all, I was captivated by the descriptions. There are descriptions of a lot of things. As with War and Peace, the point of the book is not like describing buildings, Victor Hugo goes off for 50 pages describing a building. War and Peace isn't like that. And Mr. American is not like that either. Although George MacDonald Fraser is interested in describing everything in Edwardian England. He wants you to know what the streets felt like. He wants you to know what the wharfs were like. He wants you to know what the theater was like. But he's got just the right amount of detail so that he drops in the description gradually, but you're not overwhelmed with blocks of description. And he's able to keep the story moving throughout that description. The plot's not going anywhere, but the character moments, the characters talking to each other. There is a lot of dialogue in Mr. American where you're just listening to the characters talk to each other. And most of what they say has no bearing on the plot. You're just hanging out with them. But very skillfully and very cleverly, little plot points are gradually peppered into their conversation. And sometimes they're hidden in there, so, like little tidbits that you don't think are going to be important, turn out to be important several pages later, that kind of thing. It's very artfully done, but again, the main point is just to hang out with these characters. Now, the other thing which reminded me of War and Peace is War and Peace was written about 70 years removed in time from the events it was describing. So Leo Tolstoy wrote War and Peace in 1869, but he was describing an earlier generation. He was describing 1800, and a generation which had just gone out of living memory. And Leo Tolstoy had said that his purpose in War and Peace was not to solve any great philosophical questions, but just to capture that way of life that had been their grandparents' way of life, and create a literary portrait of what the way of life had been for that generation. Again, I suspect George MacDonald Fraser is consciously emulating that, because he's got pretty much the exact same time gap. Mr. American was written in 1980, but it's describing 70 years earlier, a period from 1910 to 1914. Again, a period which is just going out of living memory at the time the book was published. And like Leo Tolstoy, his purpose seems to be to describe everything. You really do get a sense of everything in Edwardian England at the time. He recreates the local taverns, the political discussions, people discussing the political questions of the day, the streets of London, the cab drivers, the parties that the aristocratic set had, the theater. It's all in there. Reading this book, you really do get a sense of what life was like for everybody during this period of time. Another parallel with War and Peace, and this gets into a little bit of spoilers, I guess, although not really any spoilers if you know any history. But War and Peace was describing the lifestyles of the the noble Russian families right on the eve of war, when a major world war would go through and wipe out their entire way of life. Mr. American is set right on the eve of 1914. Well, it starts in 1910, but continues up to 1914. Again, on the eve of a war which is set to wipe out this way of life of Edwardian England. Now, when I get more into the details of the plot later, I thought I noticed some parallels in the relationships between the characters in War and Peace and the characters in Mr. American. But hold that thought for now. I want to talk about the plot of Mr. American a little bit. And here I'm going to get into some spoilers. And because this book is, I said before that the main point of this book is not the plot. It's hanging out with the characters. But there are some spoilers in the plot. So consider this your spoiler warning if you want to stop watching here and go out and read the book. But some spoilers. One of the reasons that you keep turning the pages with Mr. American is because you're hooked on a number of mysteries. And I said before that George MacDonald Fraser does a great job of creating these scenes that just make you want to keep turning the pages. And yes, that is part of it as well. But the other reason is you do actually have a reason to keep turning the pages. There are a number of mysteries which are slowly simmering in the background as you read this book. So the book is about an American who shows up in England one day with a mysterious fortune. Nobody knows who he is or what his backstory is. Everyone's speculating. So who is this strange American? That's question number one. Why did he come to England? Where did he get all his money? And what secrets is he hiding about his past? And then he gets into a relationship with a woman named Peggy. And this creates a whole nother set of questions because now there's some relationship drama. So he suspects that something is going on with his marriage. Does his wife love him? Is she being unfaithful? She wants money from him. What does she actually want that money for? So now we've got these questions all resolving. And those really keep you turning the pages. In addition to just wanting to hang out with the characters. The problem, in my opinion, though, is that these questions more or less get resolved by the end of the book. And then the middle of the book. And then I thought once everything was resolved, or once all the pieces were on the table, then the book lags a little bit. If I had been George MacDonald Fraser's editor, I would have said to him, okay, this slow burn you've got going for the first half of the book, that works brilliantly for the first half of the book. But you can't keep the slow burn going for the whole 585 pages. Slow burn for the first half of the book, and then we increase the momentum once we get to the halfway point of the book, so that the momentum keeps would start building faster from the midway point. It would have been an entirely different book that way, I guess. But that would have been my editorial suggestion. I don't know how many other people felt this way, but I felt like I was starting to get a little bit bored with the middle of the book. Now, the other reason that the middle of the book is boring is because the middle of the book is taken over by Helen Cessford, who is representing the suffragette movement. And George MacDonald Fraser, my impression of his politics is that he does not like progressives. Even if they're on the right side of history, he feels like they're a little bit self-righteous and smug and a little bit too proud of themselves. That's the vibe I've gotten from several of his Flashman books. And that is true of this character, Helen Cessford, whose character arc dominates the middle of the book. Now, she is Flashman's grandniece, so there's a tie-in with Flashman there. But she is portrayed as being loud, arrogant, hypocritical, and generally unlikable. And so as a consequence, even though her character arc dominates the middle of the book, I just didn't care about it because George MacDonald Fraser, I felt, was framing this as something I wasn't supposed to care about. Now, the good news is that Flashman does show up and dominate this section of the book, and that makes up for a lot. And Flashman, the character Flashman, is always entertaining when he shows up. And even though the style of this book is much different than the style of the other Flashman books, Flashman works well in this section. Although I sometimes wonder, and I've seen other people wonder this as well, would this book have worked better without any Flashman connection at all? Just cut out that middle section with Flashman and his grandniece. Like I said, the book is otherwise so different in tone and style from the other books in the Flashman series. But I do suspect that if that had happened, nobody would still be reading it now. It would have done well in 1980 and then have been forgotten about. Again, like I said at the beginning of this review, I think the only reason people still remember this book is because it ties in with the Flashman series. Or am I wrong about that? Let me know. The ending of the book, again, spoilers here, I guess, is anticlimactic. And in a sense, it's not really so much an ending as just one of those kind of open-ended endings. You know, what is the character going to do next? We don't really know. But I don't want to complain about the ending being anticlimactic, because it's the type of ending that you got the sense the book was headed for all along. The book just had such a subtle feeling that you didn't feel like it would have been appropriate to have a big climax where the characters are yelling at each other, or there was this big drama revealed, or a big shootout at the end, or something like that. That vibe wouldn't have gone with the rest of the book. So as we were getting closer to the ending, I was kind of sensing that we weren't going to get a big climax at the ending anyways. So in that sense, maybe the ending worked. I don't know. Let me know what you thought about the ending, if you've read it. All right. I'm going to jump back to something I put on hold earlier, which is talking about the relationships with these characters and seeing if we can make some more War and Peace connections here. What do you guys think? Was George MacDonald Fraser consciously emulating War and Peace with this? Or am I just making connections where none are to be found? Am I stretching things here? But I thought that the marriage between the character of Mark Franklin, aka Mr. American, and Peggy Clayton, his wife, reminded me of the marriage in War and Peace between Pierre and Princess Helen. So in both cases, a rich man is seduced into marrying a beautiful woman, and only afterwards discovers that the relationship is based on money, and she doesn't care for him at all. Or in Peggy's case, I guess it would be an exaggeration to say she doesn't care about him at all, but she cares about him strictly on her own terms. Also, in War and Peace, while Pierre is still married, he falls in love with another character while he's trapped in his marriage. In the same way, the character of Mr. American, Mark Franklin, finds himself intrigued, if maybe not entirely in love, with the character of both Pip and Helen Cessford, who are some younger female characters. I was actually expecting Mark Franklin to leave his loveless marriage and find love with another woman, as happened to the character of Pierre in War and Peace. Or I guess spoilers for War and Peace now. And when the book didn't go in that direction, I admit to being a little bit surprised. One thing that is quite different with Mr. American, though, than War and Peace, is that Mr. American revolves entirely around an American who is observing Edwardian Britain from the outside. So it's a classic, the alien from Mars storytelling. So because the American doesn't know anything about England, we see everything from his eyes, and that gives the narrator an excuse to describe everything about England. War and Peace didn't use that storytelling device. With War and Peace, we saw the Russian society strictly from the inside. And I think that I'm going to end that there. I guess we could talk about how Flashman's relationship with Edward VII was a little bit refined in a couple of the Flashman books that came later. I'm thinking particularly about Flashman and the Redskins and Flashman and the Tiger. But actually, we don't need to go there. This review is long enough. So let me know if you read Mr. American, what you thought about it. I'm fairly sure almost all the readers who came to it were impressed at how different in style and in tone it was to the other Flashman books. Would this book have worked better without the Flashman connection entirely? Do you think George MacDonald Fraser was deliberately trying to emulate the structure of War and Peace, or the themes of War and Peace, or am I just grasping at straws here when there actually wasn't anything there? What do you think about it?